So what I want to do is I want to get us thinking about our mental models for how we think about the flow of information and the sort of the flow of interaction when a user is connecting to a website that we are building ourselves. And I want to compare sort of the ideas that we had in our mind when we were developing code in WebDev 2, when we had no framework at our disposal. And I want to compare that with what we're going to be doing now that we have Rails at our disposal. And some of the ideas that you're going to see with Rails are going to be familiar to you with some of the ideas that you already saw in Programming 3 around working with ASP.NET, because a lot of the ideas that were in Rails and that were pioneered from Rails found their way eventually into products like .NET. So some of these concepts will be familiar to you, but I definitely want to make sure that we're sort of getting out of the headspace that we were in WebDev 2 when we had no framework and stepping into a new mental model for how we think about the web. And so I'm going to start by doing a little bit of a drawing here. And on the left side here, I'm going to draw. This is, and you get to see that my beautiful drawing skills. This is a happy little laptop. Gotta just, destroyed the corner of the laptop. Gotta fix that up now. There we are. So there's my happy little laptop. And this laptop is connected to the internet. That's this cloud right here. Look at that. There's the internet. And we're going to, when we talk about this particular laptop, what we really mean here, or what I really mean, is a user using a browser. And sometimes we call the browser like the user agent, right? So it's the browser we're talking about here, and the browser speaking, the language of the web, or the protocol of the web, which is HTTP, some version of HTTP or a variant thereof. And what we're going to try to imagine here is the loading of a web page by way of an HTTP GET request. And so we're going to be doing an HTTP GET request to some particular URL, like HTTP : we won't do a HTTPS, we'll do just a non-encrypted. We'll go to a domain, doesn't matter which one, and we'll go to a slash products, and then we'll load up from there like an index .php. And so this, again, this is the old model that we're dealing with here, not the new model. So this is when we were back in WebDev 2, when our browser made a request. This request would, of course, go across the internet in using the HTTP protocol. If we're using plain old HTTP, this is like a connection on port 80. What are we connecting to? We are connecting to a server. And so this is my picture of a server. It's an angry entity, sort of a grinning angry entity on the web. And the very first thing that would happen, or let's at least label this as a server. We'll label it as a server here. And what kind of server, it doesn't really matter as long as it speaks HTTP. So this might be Apache, this might be Nginx, this might be Microsoft's IIS, it could be any of those things. And when it receives this particular request, the very first thing it's going to do is it's going to go to the file system, which I will draw like that. I will say file system, and maybe I will erase that and make the file system green. So here is the file system. And we're going to look somewhere on the file system, and this portion, this right here, this portion of the path is going to map directly to some area on the file system. And so somewhere in the memory or the space of the file system, there is, if this was a Linux-based file system, we would likely have a /var/www folder, and then maybe within there we have a products folder, and maybe within there we have our index dot, oh, gotta make my cloud a little bit bigger. An index.php file. Oh, got to get working with these colors. PHP. There's my cloud. And if that file is not there, we're going to send back immediately a 404, right? Like file not found. If that file is there, well, that's great. We get to proceed on, and we're going to, by way of the file extension, pass this off to the PHP interpreter, right? So the PHP interpreter is going to look through this file, and it's going to look for PHP to interpret. And by that, what I mean is we're going to have, like, you know, somewhere within the file, maybe a mixture of HTML and, if you remember, sort of our, we have some kind of variable, and then a percent less than, and then close that P. So we have markup within the markup. Some of it denotes executable PHP, some of it actually denotes HTML. There might also be within there strings of SQL, right? And then, so if you can imagine, this is like product/index.php. So maybe we're loading up all of the products of a particular database table, maybe a products table. And so in this case, PHP might then go to the database. And so here's our database, and this is going to be a SQL query. That SQL query is going to return some results. The PHP is going to continue going through the collection of markup and PHP code, and some of that code might loop over the collection of results returned by the database, and the end result is going to be, it's not going to go to the file system, it's going to go to the server here, and that end result is HTML, and that's going to be sent back over the internet to our browser. And the browser is going to render it out, and it's also going to kick off a flurry of other requests, because embedded within this HTML document that gets returned is going to be a head section that's going to probably reference some CSS. It's probably going to reference maybe some JavaScript files, and within the document, maybe when we're looping through the collection of products being returned, maybe we are also linking to images. And so those are being requested one by one by one by the browser until we get a fully rendered, fully styled page full of images and text and colors and all the things that we're used to seeing when we interact with the web with a browser. So this was sort of the simplistic view of what was happening in WebDev 2. And the key idea that we're going to have to throw away is this idea right here, this mapping between this portion of the URL and this portion of an actual file system folder and file name. So that idea is going to go away in a framework-based environment, because we're no longer going to be mapping the path to our file system. So that's the idea that I'm going to want us to sort of remove from our brain and replace with a brand new idea. So I'm going to clear the screen here, and we'll start with that new idea. So I will clear the canvas. Beautiful, beautiful blank slate here. And once again, I'm going to start on the left-hand side here with my laptop. Keyboard on my laptop, and it's happy. It's my happy little laptop, and it's still connected to the internet. We've still got a server here, and the server is still a little bit angry, a little bit happy at the same time. Mixture of the two. And we're still making a request, right? We're still making a request, and I'm going to just write that up here. We're still making a request via HTTP. So we're making an HTTP GET request. And it's still going to some domain. I won't even write out the protocol. I'll just write out the domain. And it's going to look similar to what we had before. But in this case, it's just going to be just /products/ and we're not going to see the name of a file in the path. We're not going to see a file extension in the path before. So that's our first clue that we no longer have a mapping from URL paths to the file system. And so this is the browser over here, if we remember, and it is making this request over the internet and getting to our server. Things get a little bit more complicated here, and as I said, some of these ideas will be familiar to you from the world of .NET, but we're going to review them because we're going to spend a lot of time with these ideas in Rails. And the very first thing happens after the server gets this is a router kicks in right here. And this server, I should also note, it can still be a variety of things, right? It might still be Apache fronting a Rails application. It might still be Nginx fronting a Rails application. When we run our development server, when we run like Rails space S and we get a development server up, that is a HTTP Puma server. So Puma is just the name of an open source project, which is an HTTP server. So it could be any one of those things. And the very first step is that we go to a router. And what the router does is it's the router's job to turn URLs into particular controller actions. So just remember here, we're working with an MVC framework here, where we have a model, view, controller, but really there is one letter missing in this acronym, which is the letter R. When we think about MVC, we're usually working with an R MVC application, where the R stands for the router. That's the one that people tend to leave out for whatever reason. The I there, back in. And so this router is going to get us to the controller. Here we are. And as I said earlier, what color of pen is this? A black pen. It's the job of the router to go from a URL to a particular controller, and then further a particular action within that controller. And so each controller is a class. So Rails is a very OO thing. Each controller is a class. It's a class that inherits from a base class provided to us by the framework, just like we saw when we worked with a model, right? When we instantiated a model that would map to a particular database table, that model inherited from active record base. Well, once we get into our controllers, we're going to see that there is the equivalent of an action controller base that we will inherit from. And then what we call an action is really just like each method. Each method in this particular class is called an action. And so from now on, what you'll hear me say is you'll hear me say things like, oh, the router is going to go to the products controller's index action. And all I mean is that there's going to be in the controllers folder, you're going to find a file that's called product controller, and in it is going to be a method called index. So I just want to be clear on those terms. It's like it might sound very different the way I'm talking about things, but when I'm talking about a route or a URL mapping to a particular controller action, I just mean we can go to a particular file in our app controllers folder and look at a particular method. And then again, in this case, we can sort of imagine that we're loading up a products page. This stunguy.com/products is going to maybe list all of the products that are in a particular database table. And so this controller inside of the action that we've just routed to is going to go to a model. In our case, it's probably the product model. And it's the model that in turn is going to speak to the actual database. So there's the database, and this speaking is going to be SQL, but it's not going to be SQL that we write. When we are writing code in our controller, so we'll do a little bit of a thought bubble here coming off of our controller, we are probably doing something along the lines of setting up a variable called products and assigning it the value of product.all. And it's that product.all that's this model. That's this thing right here. And then it's the model's job to actually go and generate that SQL. So another little thought bubble here. Got to make the bubble a bit bigger this time. And this is actually going to be like a select star from products. That's generated SQL that's being executed. And then what we get back from the database is going to be all of these rows. You know, if the database, the products table has 27 rows, we're going to get all 27 rows back to the model. And then the model is going to wrap them up, like you saw in the challenge, as a collection of product objects. And then that's going to go back over to the controller. The controller is then going to hand off that data. Specifically, what happens with Rails is that any variable that we've made as an instance variable gets handed off to the associated view. So in our case, this is the products variable. This is one of the places where Rails sort of breaks the idea of object orientation. Ordinarily, with a object, our instance variables are private, right? It's encapsulated. This is our private state. But although Rails is a very OO system, it's also a system that plays fast and loose with the rules of OO when it serves when it serves the purpose, when it simplifies things. And so there are certain things that just happen auto-magically in Rails. And one of those things is that any instance variable we make inside of a action is instantly shared or automatically shared with the associated view. And what I mean by the associated view is that there's going to be some conventions that tell us which view to load up. So just like the controller is just a class in a particular file and folder, and the model is another class in another file folder, the view is just going to be another file elsewhere on the system. And this file is going to be a combination of HTML and embedded Ruby. And it's here where it's going to look most similar to the work we did in PHP. And the automatic mapping is going to happen by way of the name of the action. So let's just say that the controller and action that was sort of executed here by the router, we're going to say that the controller was some kind of products controller. And we're going to say that the action, no, not an @ sign, Kyle. That came out too easily. Just A for action. The action is an index action. And it's just like in PHP, we often use index for like the root file, sort of the main file. With Rails, index is sort of like the default collection action, the action that is associated with the entire collection. So it's going to show us all of the products. And the name index is going to have a pairing with a particular view. And so if we were to poke into this application, just like our controller is in the app controllers folder and our model is in the app models folder, our view is going to be somewhere in the app views folder. There's going to be a subfolder for all of our product views. And then there's going to be a file in there, index.html.erb, and this index here is a direct mapping to the name of the action that's being executed. Again, that's a convention. So just like it's a convention that the instance variables of the controller get automatically shared with the view, the other convention is the view that gets loaded up is automatically the view with the same name as the action in the same folder with the name of the controller. And, you know, I'm going to be talking a lot of different conventions today. So some of this will just go right through one ear and out the other when you first hear it. And, you know, we'll just be repeating this a bunch of times and working with a bunch of simple demo apps to start with. And you will eventually get and understand all these conventions. So this view, as I said, is something that looks a lot like the HTML and PHP mixture that we saw when we were working with PHP without a framework. So maybe in this view, we have less than %, and then we're going to go to this products instance variable, which now just magically exists outside of the controller object, right? So we're not accessing this as a member of the controller object inside the view, we just get a variable that's called @products, and we're going to say .each on it, do product inside of pipes, and then inside of there, maybe we're just going to print out the name of each product. So I'm going to echo out the product name. And so the way we're delimiting the embedded Ruby is with less than % and % greater than signs. And the way that we're doing an echo is the less than % equals there. And then I'm going to close this up with an end. So that part should, at least in an analogous way, feel like PHP. But notice that the view here is not the full HTML that is being sent back to the end user. It's just the HTML that is specific to this particular action. And so the next part of the data journey here is a layout. And it's here where all of the HTML that is common to the rest of the application will come in, right? So like the actual HTML element, the head element, and then maybe like inside of this head element, I'm just putting this in comments, is going to be where we're loading up like JavaScript and CSS and our metadata and all of that kind of stuff. I won't bother writing it all out. And then we're also going to have a body inside of here, and somewhere inside of this body is going to be a line that looks like this, which is less than % equals yield, and it's that yield is where the actual view is going to be embedded in the layout. So like all of this right here, this entire thing is going to go into that yield. And this is super handy having this layout because, for example, if we have some common markup that we want to appear on every single page, so if we had like a header and maybe a logo that we wanted to make appear on every page, we might put that in here. This is where the header would go. And if we had some footer that we wanted to appear at the bottom of every page, well, that might sort of be sandwiched in below this yield, and we might have a sidebar in there or whatever, right? So all the common markup exists inside of this layout, and the action specific HTML and ERB exists inside of the view. And then at this point, we are now finally ready for this to be sent back to our server. It is now in a final state of like just being HTML. And then it's that HTML which is returned over the internet and back, reaches our browser. And again, like PHP, this sets off another sort of flurry of activity where we're going to be, or the browser is going to be requesting the JavaScript and requesting the CSS and maybe requesting any images that are present in the file. When those requests come to the server, they don't go through this entire process. This process with the router is only for controller actions. When we're requesting assets like image assets or JavaScript assets or CSS assets, the server goes to what is called the Rails asset pipeline. And that acts more like the file system. It's not exactly the file system, but you can think of it as the file system. I say it's not exactly like the file system because it works a little bit differently depending on if we're in development mode on our own machine or in production mode after actually deploying the application. But you can think of the asset pipeline as being JavaScript and CSS and images that are just on the file system and being served out in a more stereotypical way of just serving out from the file system. So hopefully this diagram makes a little bit of sense to you. We're going to return to it throughout this course. There is a version of this diagram in the notes, and so if we look at these Rails hints notes, you will see a portion of it that was drawn on an actual whiteboard back when I was actually in a real world classroom with an actual marker in my hand. You can see my rectangles look a lot neater when I have an actual whiteboard at my disposal. I get more colors though on a virtual whiteboard, especially that crazy rainbow pen, which I love so much. Does anyone have any initial questions or comments about this? And I haven't been looking at the chat, so I'm just going to take a peek to see what we have going on here. And there's some mentions here that like this is similar to how the router and routes can work in Node, especially with something like Express. You can definitely think of Express as working in that same way, where you're sort of taking in or capturing URL routes and mapping them to executable code. And then what is that? Can you cut up the view so that part of it ends up in the body and some of it ends up in the head? Yes, you can. There are ways. So Adam is asking, like, is there a way to sort of go beyond this idea of just delivering this single payload from the view into just this yielded area? There are ways to do that. That's sort of, I can only teach so much of Rails, so I don't go into that particularly, but you can definitely do that. So you could target, for example, if you wanted to, from the view, be able to set what was the content of the title tag. Right, that's a common thing that we would want to do. There is a way from the view to get content into there, or you could have, you know, different types of footers appear on different page and have that controllable from the view as well. That's something that I'll leave up as an exercise to the reader because it goes a little bit beyond the sort of level. There's just so much to Rails that I could talk and talk and talk for years and probably not get to all of it. So I try to limit what I teach here, but you can always dig deeper, especially looking into those guides and to see what is possible. So yeah, all of that stuff is capable. And later on in the course, we're going to completely rip out a portion of this. Later on in the course, we're going to rip out this whole piece here, this layout and the view, and we're going to replace it with React. Right? We're going to still have the router and the controller, but what's going to be returned is no longer HTML and ERB, it's going to be JSON. So we're going to end up developing Rails applications that act like JSON APIs, and then the view and the layout are going to be now part of a front-end framework. They're going to be React on the front end. React is going to be making these connections. So within the browser, we're going to have React client-side framework running within the user's browser, making requests to our Rails router. The controller, the model are still present, but instead of the view, we're going to be going off and generating JSON and returning that instead. So that's going to be coming up later on in the course. And so we're going to maintain some of this diagram, but we're going to replace this portion of it. And that's going to come after midterms. And so Sanders is saying, was Ruby on Rails the first framework to develop MVC? MVC itself as a pattern has been around for a really long time. So it was developed in the early days of GUI, basically GUI interfaces back at the research facility Xerox PARC, where like Xerox machines came from. So the researchers at Xerox PARC came up with this idea of model view controller. But yes, David Hannemeyer Hansen is sort of instrumental as the creator of Rails of making that pattern really, really common on the web. And Rails is considered sort of the first of, it might not be the first, but it was the first to really popularize the idea of MVC as a way of dealing with the web and web frameworks. And the ideas from Rails have sort of branched out, and a lot of the other systems that you see out there, although they've gone beyond just being Rails clones, they started off their life as Rails clones. So like Django and Laravel, those are the Rails clones in the Python and PHP communities. The JavaScript community, I mean, there used to be this thing called Sails. I mean, Sails is still around, and it was like Rails for JavaScript. MVC hasn't been as big of a thing in the pure JavaScript. You tend to do things on a bit of a smaller scale, so it's very common in the JavaScript world to use more like Node and Express. And Express is more modeled after the Ruby programming framework Sinatra. And Sinatra was sort of like a mini Rails, and then the ideas from Sinatra turned into in Python, Sinatra was cloned to make something called Flask. And then in the JavaScript world, Sinatra was cloned to make Express. And so a lot of these ideas that came out of the Ruby community have sort of ended up in other languages, other frameworks. So you'll see echoes of these things basically everywhere we do web development now.